That's a great question, and something that we actually asked the FAA. That's what led to their response. So we said, where is this line? We agree that I can post on a bulletin board. We agree that I can call up one friend. How many friends can I call up before this becomes an issue? If I call a stranger, does that make a difference? And it seems like that was the angle they were trying to take, even though it's not described in the law. They were trying to make the case that, well, with friends and family, it's okay, but with a stranger, it's not. That's what they were trying to say, even though it has no impact on the safety of the flight. That's the approach they were taking. And again, when we said, well, where is this line of can I call, can I email, how many people can I include? That's when they said, well, send us another request for interpretation. We'll get back to it in 6 months.
What about TSA?
Sorry, and TSA, we did not hear any pushback from TSA. We didn't really hear any pushback on security at all because, again, we're not changing the nature of the flight. We're just changing how they connect. So we did not get any pushback on that.
Willem van Latem, I'm with the Dutch Embassy. You mentioned Europe a lot concerning your flight sharing thing and with Wingly, and we've been looking into that a lot. But with Wingly, pilots are not allowed to make a profit. So my question to you is like, how big do you see the market for flight sharing? As for example, with Uber, there's a profit for all parties involved, like drivers win, I win because I got here cheap and Uber gets a share. But with flight sharing, your supply is kind of limited to pilots willingly to fly out. How do you see that in the future in Europe, and even if it gets regulated here in the US?
Yeah, I think there's tremendous opportunity for growth. If you compare commercial airplanes, they're in the air almost 70% of the time. It's really, really a high percentage that those planes are flying. And if you contrast that to general aviation, you can just go to any airport and you see it just covered with airplanes, and most of them aren't flying. So there is so much potential to get those planes in the air and get them flying. The issue is the rising costs, and we're seeing that. We're seeing a decline in the number of pilots, and the biggest issue is the rising costs. Now, if you talk to any pilot and say, would you fly more if it were a quarter of the cost? I would be surprised if the answer was no. And that's where we can really drive the industry, is we can get more flights happening. We can help general aviation, help out these local airports by making flying cheaper.
And I would add to that, if you look at the European experience, I mean, all you've seen is growth in flight sharing since the platforms arrived. And they continue to grow, and you're getting tens of thousands of users. I think, we're like tens of thousands of pilots. I think we're upwards of 100,000 connections. Like they're just like really, really growing fast. I mean, the commercial viability long term, I'm not sure if that's a question regulators should be concerned with. I mean, even if this is people just not even pro rata share. I mean, like whether or not profit is made, shouldn't be too much of a concern to the regulators. The underlying question should be, is it fundamentally unsafe? Right, and I think when you look at the role that platforms can play, you look at the fact that you've had flight sharing in Europe now for 4 years, and you haven't had and any of these platforms, you haven't had a single accident, fatality. Like they've been exemplary on that regard, and I think that should be the chief concern among regulators, not so much how does this impact the commercial viability of other platforms, or even what does this do, what is the long-term commercial viability? I think at the end of the day, these agencies are safety agencies, and that should be their concern, regardless of if it's the NATA or the commercial airlines or private pilots. That safety is ultimately what we're after.
Okay.
Have you thought about talking to the Institute for Justice, whether they could support your case?
We did speak with them. We had already been working with Goldwater, the Goldwater Institute at the time. So they've been helping really push the issue.
I'll go over to Thank you. Brent Score at Mercatus Center at GMU. Two questions, if I may. One, are flight sharing operators classified as private carriers in Europe, or are they common carriers with waivers, or something else? And two, related, why go through the heavy lift of imperfect legislation on this when it seems like the issue is this bizarre interpretation by the FAA of what common carriage means? So why not persuade the administrator that, I mean, this is a bizarre interpretation? If they're trying to get safety, I'm sure they have tools to go after it that way.
Yeah, so first question on Europe. And sorry, can you repeat the first part of your question?
How are they classified in Europe? Are they common carriers with waivers, or are they private carriers, or something else?
So they operate similar to Part 91 here, where they are just a private pilot flying recreationally. And that's how the classification works here as well, is they're just private pilots sharing their cost. There's a specific line that's an exemption to compensation when they're just pro rata splitting the cost. So they're not a business operator at all. They aren't here. They aren't in Europe. They're just sharing the cost. So that's really the big thing there.
And to the second question, I think maybe this sort of requires a question. From the time that the request for interpretation was answered to the time the Supreme Court denied cert, was it a matter of 24 months?
It was at least 2 years.
2 years. So it was 2 years in court, both at the district court and the Court of Appeals, and then at the Supreme Court for 2 years, right? 3 levels. I mean, the FAA has demonstrated that they're going to steadfastly stand behind this interpretation, right? So the question of well, maybe just convince the FAA that what they've done is backward and they should change it. I think the FAA has, since 2014 now, we have 4 years where they haven't taken a step in any direction other than the one they were already heading into. So I think there's been plenty of opportunity for the FAA to reverse course, throughout the course of the litigation, throughout, both the Senate and the House contemplating what to do on flight sharing. The FAA being looped in, I think, the entire time. There are plenty of opportunities for the FAA to be like, you know what, actually, we are going to reconsider. They haven't done that, so to your question of why not just, talk to the administrator? I think they've demonstrated, their support for their previous interpretation and their unwillingness, I think, to turn it around.
And if you think about what that does for innovation, I mean, we haven't been able to raise additional funding. I mean, the only reason that we're able to still keep fighting, and the reason I'm here today, is because I care about this issue personally as a pilot. I want to see this succeed. We've been really lucky to have all of the people who've helped us pro bono of just wanting to help out and care about this issue. But I mean, it's been 4 years. We haven't been able to raise additional investment. We haven't been able to work on this full time. It becomes really difficult for new companies to create new things when you've got this type of position from the FAA.
Thank you, Dave Rubinowitz. I don't understand exactly how FlightNow operated. What did FlightNow provide its users that they couldn't get from Facebook, and what was the business model?
Sure. So FlightNow was effectively an online bulletin board, similar to Facebook in that sense, but what we did was we provided the additional verification of the pilots. So instead of just seeing their profile with a photo of a plane on it, you're seeing that they are an actual pilot. You can see how many hours they've flown recently. You can see their reviews. So it created a place where the pilot was actually verified.
So I think just put in context the way flight sharing happens now in the analog sense, right? I mean, the value proposition for FlightNow is to dramatically reduce the search costs. So if I want to engage in flight sharing now, I think I'd have to drive out to Leesburg from here, look on the bulletin board, find some names, the old school tearaways, right? Where it's like, I'm ripping this away, I'm calling people, I'm trying to arrange this. There's no real efficient process to doing this in the current analog format. So the digital format of this, the digital corkboard, is one where the search costs, the transaction costs of finding pilots and passengers dramatically reduced to make connections more efficient, and thereby increase the amount of these connections, right? To make it easier for people to find one another without having to drive out to an airport on the off chance that they might not see anything posted at all. I mean, you're taking a huge risk in terms of your time, to even try to make that connection in the current analog format.
And to put that in context, there are currently 5 million flight hours per year with commercial airliners. In general aviation, it's 25 million flight hours. So and granted, those are smaller planes, but there is a tremendous opportunity even just to put people on those empty seats. So that's what we're trying to achieve. And I'd love for this, even if it could be legal on Facebook, but we don't even have clear guidance on that today.
This points out all of the problems with administrative law that's often reft of due process. Have you considered reframing this so that you leave the FAA out, just have an information service like an employment agency or a dating service, so to speak? Uber and Couchsurfing and all of these places are currently running into all kinds of problems of people telling them to shut down, and they just answer the mail of the people who are telling them to shut down and keep on keeping on. Have you considered doing that? There's also the medical transport that doesn't charge at all. They just, the pilots are doing the same thing you're doing. However, if you like our service, here's a card for a donation where you can pay, and this would have cost you $3,500 for a charter. Give us $30 or whatever. Have you considered doing something like this to reframe what's going on with draining the swamp of the problems of administrative law?
We haven't considered that, and the reason is pilots invest tens of thousands of dollars to get their pilot's license. The last thing we would want to do is to jeopardize that or to put them in a position where they might be subject to a restriction or get their license taken away. So the FAA is also very clear on their stance on compensation and on what may be considered compensation. So we made that very clear to our pilots that you can't accept a dinner, you can't accept a tip. We will help you to make sure that you are getting the maximum allowable amount of pro rata share, but no more than that. And that the FAA is very strict on that. So we wanted to make sure that we fell within those guidelines, and